Facilities that make this program possible are provided by the City of Highland Park. Programs are produced independently by members of the community. The City of Highland Park is not affiliated with the following program or the producers of public access programming and is not responsible for the content. The following program does not reflect the opinions of the City of Highland Park.
Welcome to another edition of What's This Show For? FOR, Friends of Ron. I'm your host, Ron Levitsky. If you're like me, you have a desire for closure. As a history teacher, I always wondered what really happened to Amelia Earhart. Or was JFK really assassinated by Lee Harvey Oswald acting alone? Well, those kind of questions probably haunt many of you as well. Today, we may be able to put your mind at ease regarding one question about perhaps the most infamous crime in history, which is the unsolved murders by Jack the Ripper, unsolved until recently by one of our own dear friends, Brenda Rossini. Brenda, welcome to the show, and I'm just delighted to have you here to help us get some closure on ripping the mask off Jack the Ripper.
Thank you, Ron. I can also rip the mask off the JFK assassination.
That's another show.
Okay.
All right. Thank you, though. Let's introduce you to the audience. The slight accent, I can ascertain you weren't born in this country.
No, I was not.
And where were you from?
Dorset, England.
Okay.
Where I picked primroses, cowslips, and other yellow flowers.
How long did you live in England?
13, until age 13.
Okay.
Yeah.
So you came over, and I imagine it was quite a shock, huh?
Well, a bit. It was dirty in New York.
Indoor plumbing, though.
Very good.
Okay. But you had a very distinguished career. Not many people know this because of all your other accolades, but you are a wonderful criminal attorney, right? Defense attorney?
Criminal defense lawyer, yeah. Well, the victims weren't so happy about it, but the defendants were.
Okay. And how long did you practice?
28 years.
Okay. I bet you are in some very interesting cases.
Well, interesting, yes. Bloody.
Okay.
Murderous.
That's another show. Okay. What has always fascinated me about you are your varied interests, although a lot of them seem to revolve around England of, say, the 19th century. I know that you were in a Jane Austen, Charles Dickens, a history group, and of course you're a very noted Sherlockian. Is that right?
True.
What attracted you to that era? I imagine England because you're English.
England, yes, forever. It was very difficult for me to give it up when I came to America. Every time I heard God Save the Queen, with Gilbert and Sullivan, I stood up, whatever. And it was difficult for me at first to, pledge allegiance and that sort of thing. And I was a history buff, I think, all my life. I was always interested in murders, especially of the male species, but I like to read. I'm a voracious reader, and Charles Dickens described Victorian England, and Conan Doyle described sort of an upper class changing England. So that's where my interests are.
All right. Well, certainly talking about crime, Sherlock Holmes, brings us back to that era of London in the late 19th century. And again, this incredibly famous, still debated murder of a series of women by someone known to history as Jack the Ripper. Now, let's set the stage. What was London like, especially the London where Jack the Ripper prowled around, 1888?
That was when he murdered, right. And the area about which you're talking is or was Whitechapel in the 1880s. That specific area was 95% Jewish and Jewish immigrants.
Somewhat ironic, it was called Whitechapel and not Whitechapel, right?
Very good. I wish I had thought of that.
Let's-
But one of the murders was near the great synagogue of the Rabbi
Okay.
Adler.
And what was Whitechapel like back then?
A filthy, sort of a overcrowded tenement area, poor, again, outdoor plumbing, cesspools, and outdoor water pumps for people who needed water, which, of course, got polluted.
I read someone described the area as being kind of a labyrinth of all these streets and alleys twisting
Right.
and winding, which would relate to the story that
Sure,
we talk about.
but
Okay.
many of the old streets were like that, where Samuel Johnson lived. There were all these little streets.
Okay, and this was essentially a Jewish area. Jewish immigrants came there. Is there any reason why they happened to come in such a mass in that time period?
So you're talking about the time period of the 1880s, and this particular man that I identified as Jack the Ripper came with his family from Russo, Poland, because Russia was carving up sections of Poland for itself. There were lots and lots of Eastern European Jews. Pogroms, accusations by the superstitious,
And the Tsar had been assassinated not that long before.
Right. Alexander II was, and there was a pogrom after that in Warsaw. And that was not over the Tsar's death, but just a way of attacking the Jews.
Okay, and let's go a little bit further into this area. So this area would have been policed probably more heavily than other areas, but what was the police force like back in the late 19th century?
Well, the police force came about in 1820 or 29 by Sir Robert Peel, and that's why they were called Bobbies, after Robert Peel, who was a prime minister with Victoria, and it progressed from that time slowly but surely. There weren't, photography was just coming out. They didn't have crime scene separation. They didn't have the little yellow ribbons. They didn't keep the crime scene clean or intact or free of footsteps, that sort of thing. They didn't have any forensic techniques. They didn't know how to surveil, and they certainly had a web of informers.
Okay, so we go back in time to the year 1888 to Whitechapel, which is this heavily populated area with Jewish people, but just not a very pleasant place as you described
Right.
it. So, what happens at that time?
Well, at that time, there are a series of serial killings pretty quickly, one after another, in a short time frame. And at least the five that are attributed to Jack the Ripper, 5 prostitutes of Gentile background, Christian background, Irish or English, were murdered.
And to kind of clarify this, so these were women who we'd call streetwalkers in the sense that they were alone. They weren't in a house of ill repute. They were walking
They
alone.
weren't in brothels, that's
Okay.
correct. They were just poor as church mice, and they liked their drink, and that's the way they picked up a few pennies. How else would a woman make money in those days? FDR didn't come around until after the Great Depression.
Okay, so these were 5 women, and the crimes took place.
5 women to which,
we attribute.
yeah.
Okay, and this took place in approximately 2 months, a 2-month period, about 8 weeks, and it certainly terrorized the community to have this happen so quickly. Can we go a little bit further into the nature of the crimes? In other words, besides the fact that they happened fairly quickly after one another, were there any patterns or any similarities among the
pattern
victims?
and similarity which were attributed solely to Jack the Ripper was that their necks were sliced cleanly from left to right, cutting off the trachea, the esophagus, the jugular, which is what the Italians do. But anyway, so that would leave them insensible. And that
dead.
was
Eventually dead, right?
dead quickly.
Okay.
And that's what defined them so far as similarity.
Now, did the press play this up, or did some of these happen quickly so that there was no chance of a copycat?
There were, the Scotland Yard investigated this case until about 1912, and there were a few copycats in the year and a half or so that the Jack the Ripper murders stopped. So from about 1890 to 1891, there were a couple of more, but they separated them because they were not sliced to make them insensible. They were just kind of cut around. They were just different.
Okay, and has there been, I'm sure there's been speculation about why the murderer suddenly stopped?
Well, that's a story.
Do you want to have that at the end when you talk about the man you've chosen to be the...
I suppose.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. And then how effective were the police, in your opinion? Given the fact that it's, the 1880s.
Right. Well, they had almost 1,000 witnesses, so-called witnesses and informers. They had letters, one of which was written by some jokester and signed Jack the Ripper, and the salutation was, "Dear boss," to say, this is what he's doing. They had all of these letters to follow up, and they didn't have really a knowledge of how to follow those letters up. And the press called them PUNCH, for example, the Defective Department of Criminal Instigation, rather than Detective Division.
Now,
yeah.
who coined the phrase Jack the Ripper?
One of these writers, a letter to Scotland Yard that, hey, I'm the killer. Guess who I am?
And he called himself Jack the Ripper?
Called himself Jack the Ripper.
Okay. All right. So let's take a look, before we get to the person you've identified as the Ripper, let's talk about other candidates who've been brought forward over the years.
There have been many. There were, they started all of these investigations and researches after Scotland Yard released a few of the records, because for a long time they were adamant about not releasing them, and I think they started about the 60s. But if you look at the records, there were lots of people in the fire, and in the books that have been written, some are claimed to have been the Ripper, but I find that they were loosey-goosey with the time, because you had to have been there. And there was a South African, Joe Fox, who was identified by a South African historian, von Onselen, I think his name was. But and he traveled, this Joe Fox, from New York to London, and he was a porn expert, in the time that photographs were coming out. This is what guys wanted to do, I guess, to live large without having to work very hard. But he wasn't in Whitechapel in 1888. He may have passed through in 1890, there was no proof that he did, but he lived in South Africa, so that was one of them.
How about, I read that Lewis Carroll, Alice in Wonderland.
Well, they've written about Lewis Carroll's rather fervid occupation with young girls, not with prostitutes. And somebody then who was an anti-Lewis Carroll guy wrote that he had hidden anagrams or allusions to killing, and he was excluded.
Okay, and famous artist at the time, Walter Sickert?
Right, that Patricia Cornwell,
who's a famous mystery author.
Correct. She's written 2 books that he was the one who did it, but Walter Sickert was a famous painter, And why he would have gone to Whitechapel to kill these prostitutes, she can't really answer.
He was kind of fascinated. I understand he did a painting of like Jack the
Right,
Ripper.
but people were. They had a morbid interest in this.
Okay.
There weren't as many murders in Whitechapel as there was morbid interest in what was going on. He, at the time, lived in France with his long-term mistress, so, you know, she couldn't really place him then. He may have written a few of those letters. He may have, but there was nothing else to describe.
And I understand that member of royalty, a grandson of Queen Victoria.
Right, Prince Albert Victor, named after Prince Albert and herself, and that was, I thought, a little laughable, because for a prince to walk through that filthy slum, he had been charged, or was alleged, that he was a homosexual, and he frequented a homosexual brothel, which does not put him in with prostitutes, number one. Number two, he liked to be indoors, inside a brothel, not on the street, the way Jack the Ripper did.
Okay.
And he died young of syphilis or influenza, or both.
Okay.
Double whammy.
So let's go to the person you've identified, who was a suspect at the time. His name was mentioned, Aaron Kosminski.
Correct.
Now you wrote a treatise in 2012 identifying him. More recently, a gentleman named Russell Edwards has supported that claim with some kind of unusual evidence.
DNA evidence.
Yeah, which is unusual because of the way he said he obtained it. Could you briefly go over that?
Well, when I wrote about Aaron Kosminski, there was no thought of DNA. I never read about any pieces of cloth or drops at all at the time. But there was something that struck me about that graffiti. And
Now, graffiti, we haven't mentioned that.
well, that was what struck me.
Okay.
There was graffiti written in chalk above a passageway of the fourth murdered woman by the name of Catherine Eddowes. And the graffiti said, the Jews will not be blamed for nothing. And the Jews was spelled J-U-W-E-S. And I thought to myself, you know, the Brits, they call them Hebrews or Israelites or Jews. Benjamin Disraeli was called an old Jew, J-E-W. But maybe having been schooled in Hebrew and such, he spelled it like the tribe of Judah, which would have been J-U. Who knows, but that's what I thought. And I thought it was remarkably personal, that phrase for the graffiti, and why he would have written it up there in chalk, that, you know, you want to blame Jews for blood libels or something. Here you've got something to blame us for. That's what sparked my interest. And
But that could have been any Jew at this point, right? I mean,
but there weren't any Jews who were accused. He also had experience in a butchery. And
well, let's back up a little bit about his biography.
Mm-hmm.
So in some ways, he was typical of the thousands of immigrants coming from Poland and Russia, right?
right, except he was young,
Okay.
and he must have learned English to be able to write in the English language, even though he misspelled and wrote the Jews in the other way. And at one point, they said he was conversing with one of the prostitutes, so obviously he was able to speak in English.
So there were eyewitnesses who saw him in the area?
Someone identified him. It was, you know, they would know one another. Remember, the Catherine Eddowes was killed like a block from the Great Synagogue.
Okay, so let's talk about the DNA evidence that somebody else says points to this man as the killer.
Well, Russell Edwards, this author, went to bought a scarf at an auction that he claimed was the scarf. First, it was Catherine Eddowes. Then he decided, after they did some tests, that it was a Russian scarf, that it must have been
The murderers.
Aaron Kosminski's. That,
Okay.
yeah, because he said, come on, why is a man carrying this scarf? And when I looked at the scarf, I thought, that's a new scarf. I'd wear it. It was just no blood spots whatsoever in the picture. And some biochemist, Lehuilinen, I think was his name, he was a biochemist, he claimed there were drops of her blood and his semen on...
His meaning Kosminski.
Kosminski's, yes, not Russell Edwards.
Right.
And that these showed conclusively or inconclusively from descendants, unidentified, of Catherine Eddowes and Aaron Kosminski.
So I'm inferring from your tone that while you believe that Kosminski is indeed the Ripper, this evidence doesn't persuade you in and of itself.
Right. I felt that the press went wild over it, but nobody brought out that scarf looked brand new, that the descendants of the police officer who allegedly took this scarf never came forth, privacy or whatever, or that they held it all that time, which would have contaminated the scarf. And
okay, so let's why don't you give us the most salient points or reasons why you think Kosminski was indeed Jack the Ripper?
Well, as I said, first I was intrigued by that graffito always. And then I saw that he had been, they couldn't figure out whether it was a barber or a butcher, but the Scotland Yard went to Butcher's Row in all those little warrens of Whitechapel, the kosher butcher, of course, and that's where he worked, but he must have had just side work, perhaps, that his family sent him on, where he would have had a long knife, where he would have learned, or else he knew from when he cut chickens back in Poland, where he knew how to cut a chicken quickly in the Jewish tradition, the ritual tradition of not causing pain to the animal. And it was from left to right, and he would have cut the trachea, the jugular, the esophagus, and that sort of thing. So I thought, that's what it did. And you had to have a long, strong, bladed knife without any defects on it whatsoever. They never found the knife. Could have been returned to the butcher's row or whatever. And that was another thing that struck me. And I felt that these women were killed in the manner that he had learned and worked at a kosher butcher's.
Now, you also mentioned a relationship to the Sabbath and the high holidays.
Yeah, that was another thing that the police noted, was that they always happened on the weekend. And when I looked at the dates for the Shabbos, the Jewish Sabbath, the high holidays, and Yom Kippur, they were in that time frame of the women being killed. And the chickens getting ready for the Sabbath were killed at night, which is when perhaps he had his job, and he would have walked home, and before, dusk on a Friday, he would, in the middle of the night, and he would have seen these women on the way home, and
okay,
accosted them.
So,
filled with blood.
So, a lot of Jewish men could have fit this profile. Are you saying that because he was seen in the area or he was identified, you're putting all that together?
He was identified. They surveilled the places where he lived with his family. They surveilled Butcher's Row, where he may have worked at a kosher butcher. Yes, and because he knew how to kill. And the last woman, Mary Jean Kelly, they had these rude photographs in those days, and the frontal section of her was also killed the way a chicken would have been, and its limbs set apart and then bled. And she was bled just as all kosher chickens would have been bled.
Well, What happened to Kosminski?
You know, in about several months later, there were 2 other murders that there was publicity that it could have been Jack the Ripper. Perhaps his family thought he's out doing it again. So about a year after he had stopped, he was out walking an unmuzzled dog on the street, and a police constable stopped him. So I imagined he needed that dog for protection, and they went, he and his brother, who was his guardian, his brother was Ruth, and stepped up as his guardian and stated that Aaron's name was Aaron Abrams, as in the son of Abram Kosminski. So they were already fudging the last name. So they must have had a sense of what Aaron had been up to. So he's, convicted of walking an unmuzzled dog because the police officer was there for as a witness. There is no conversation or testimony that I read by Aaron Kosminski, but then the family really starts getting ready to put him away safely, which is when, after that police arrest of his for that dog, I would imagine during that time they had to gather the records, they had to find a reputable doctor who would sign a certificate for his commitment that he was a lunatic, and they had a whole series of things that he was guilty of not working, but then that's probably to get no payment, pro bono asylum for him.
Okay, and when was he committed?
In 1891, by his mother, who had arrived.
So that was just a couple years later.
Right.
Okay, and why do you think he wasn't taken more seriously as a suspect?
I think that the police, who were English, just like the asylum staff, were hesitant, number one, to cause any upsurge of fear in the Whitechapel Jewish community, and it must have been difficult to talk with Yiddish-speaking immigrants, all over the place. So he was in there, but they were sort of reticent about really naming him. And when he was committed and it all stopped, they never came to speak to him ever, but the murder stopped.
Okay. You're Sherlockian, and I couldn't help being amused when. Well, first of all, tell the audience if somebody wanted to look this up, your article, where would they look?
Sherlockian Ruminations of a Stormy Petrel is the book.
Okay, Sherlockian Ruminations of a Stormy Petrel, which is your
handle. My
your
Sherlockian
hand. Stormy Petrel.
Stormy Petrel, yes.
A bird, not the oil.
Premonitions, like the albatross. I was like the little brother of an albatross.
And you basically said that maybe the Jack the Ripper had read Conan Doyle's first Sherlock Holmes story because there's graffiti in Studied Scarlet.
Correct. With Rosh, that Sherlock Holmes deciphered immediately to really be short for Rachel, and not revenge.
Yeah, and that's interesting to think of the Ripper, because the story was published a year before.
Right.
So interesting. Well,
and dated. And Dr. Watson said it was 1888. Wasn't that a coincidence?
Yes. And you wanted to give a shout out before we leave, because we're almost out of time, to your knitting friends.
No, they are not knitting friends. They are needlepointing friends. Emily Stitchery, Emily
right there.
Posner Sobel, who owns Emily Stitchery in Northbrook and has a whole gang of fabulous needlepointers, myself included.
Well, Brenda, thank you so much. We learned a lot, and maybe this is cleared up for you. I'll take your word for it and the evidence that you presented.